My own son looked me dead in the eye, his voice cutting through the church. "You were never a father. Robert is my blood, not you." The congregation gasped. My knees trembled beneath the pew. Snow still clung to my coat. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The snow outside the church hadn't melted yet when my son's words struck me harder than the cold ever could. "You were never a father. Robert is my blood, not you." His voice thundered through the sanctuary, echoing off marble walls, tearing through me like stone shattering glass. Heads turned. Gasps spread like wildfire through the congregation. I sat frozen in the pew, my coat damp with melted snow, my hands trembling against the wood. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. My Ethan, my boy I raised alone, looked at me as if I were a stranger trespassing on holy ground. I searched his eyes for mercy, for a flicker of memory. Late nights of me rocking him to sleep. Mornings, I walked him to school with a lunchbox in hand. 2 years, I gave away piece by piece of my body and soul so he could stand tall. But there was nothing, only contempt. The chandeliers above swayed gently, their light shimmering across the polished floor, as though even the heavens shook from the violence of his words. My knees pressed together, my back stiffened, but still I could not rise. My voice, once strong enough to command crews on construction sites, died in my throat. I wanted to say, "I am your father. I gave you everything." But shame glued my tongue to silence. Then he smirked. My son, my flesh, turned his face toward Robert, the man my ex-wife remarried, the man who had always stood just outside my shadow, and with a proud tilt of his head declared, "That's my real father." The congregation looked from Ethan to me, their judgment heavy and merciless. No one stood, no one spoke for me. I was erased in a single sentence. Snowflakes clung to my boots, my breath fogged in the air. My heart pounded so loud I feared it would echo louder than the organ. The pew beneath my hands might as well have been an executioner's block, and as Ethan's words still hung in the air, I felt the truth burn into me. I was no longer a father in his eyes, just a burden he had chosen to cast away before God, before family, before the world. Long before the church humiliation, the poison had been dripping slowly into my son's veins. It began the day my ex-wife remarried Robert. He had wealth, polish, and a way of making me seem small without ever raising his voice. At first, Ethan was cautious, unsure how to treat this new man. But Robert knew how to win him over with expensive gifts, promises of opportunity, and whispers that money mattered more than sacrifice. I remember Ethan's teenage years, how he once clung to me after school, asking for help with homework or how to fix his bike chain. But gradually he began to mimic Robert's sharp tone, repeating phrases I'd never spoken. "Why do you still drive that old truck, Dad?" he asked once, his voice dripping with embarrassment instead of curiosity. Another time, at a school event, he insisted Robert sit with him at the front while I lingered at the back. Each small cut felt survivable until they added up. Robert played the long game. He would pat Ethan on the shoulder at family gatherings and slide him envelopes with cash. He spoke loudly about his vision for Ethan's future, while I sat quiet, knowing I had emptied my own pockets just to pay his tuition. The contrast was obvious. Robert shone like gold. I carried the dust of construction on my boots, and slowly Ethan started choosing shine over sweat. The distance grew sharper after college. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations never came. When I did reach him, he spoke to me like a formality, a chore. "Once," he said plainly, "you wouldn't understand business, Dad. Robert's helping me with real opportunities." That single word, real, sliced deeper than any insult. It was as though my decades of sacrifice, my double shifts, my sleepless nights, were counterfeit. I told myself it was a phase, that once Ethan matured, he would see through the glitter and remember the father who carried him through storms. But every year, the light in his eyes, when he looked at me, dimmed. In its place, I saw something colder contempt, taught, nurtured, and sharpened by Robert's hand. By the time Ethan married into wealth, the transformation was complete. My son no longer looked at me as his father. He looked at me as the past, something to be discarded, hidden, erased. The first time Ethan truly humiliated me in public was subtle, almost easy to miss, but I felt it burn deep in my bones. It was at a family gathering, the kind of event where laughter usually softened old wounds. Everyone crowded near the fireplace, glasses raised, ready for a family photo. I stood near Ethan, smiling despite the ache in my back from a week of hard labor at a part-time job. But when the photographer waved us together, Ethan turned sharply, his face stiff with disdain. "Step back, Dad. This is for family only." The words struck harder than any fist. Conversations paused, eyes shifted, and though no one spoke, I could hear the unspoken judgment in the silence. I forced a smile, as though his command hadn't sliced me open. I stepped away, shoulders heavy, the warmth of the fire no match for the sudden chill inside me. The picture was taken without me. My son stood proud between his mother and Robert, their faces glowing with satisfaction. I was a ghost, standing in plain sight. I lingered at the edge of the room, glass in hand, pretending to sip as if nothing had happened. But I saw the side glances, the awkward smiles. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to pity me or ignore me. I chose their comfort over my own pain, holding my head high, pretending I hadn't just been cut from my own bloodline. That night, when I returned to my small apartment, I pulled out an old photo of Ethan as a boy, missing teeth, hair sticking up from sleep, holding my hand as we crossed the street. I held that frame against my chest until the room blurred with tears. I whispered, "You'll remember one day. You'll remember who held you up." But deep inside, I feared the truth. He already had, and he had chosen to forget. Ethan's wedding should have been a day of pride for me, a father watching his son step into a new life. Instead, it was the day I realized I had been fully replaced. The ceremony was grand, lavish beyond anything I had ever known: crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, a ballroom filled with people in suits more expensive than my yearly wages. I wore my best jacket, pressed the night before, but even then, I felt like an intruder in a world I had sacrificed to help him reach. When the music began and the bride appeared, I looked for my place of honor. Instead, I found my seat marked at the back, away from the front rows where family Saturday. My heart sank, but I forced a smile, telling myself it was a mistake. Then I saw Robert, immaculately dressed, escorting my ex-wife down the aisle. The guests applauded. The photographers leaned forward, and I, Ethan's real father, was hidden in the shadows. During the reception, I tried to approach Ethan, to raise a toast, to share even one word that might remind him of where he came from. But before I could lift my glass, he interrupted. "I want to thank the man who showed me what true fatherhood means, Robert." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Robert's hand rested proudly on Ethan's shoulder. My own hand trembled around the glass, but I forced it upward anyway, clinking quietly against no one else's, offering a toast no one cared to hear. I sat through the rest of the night invisible. Waiters moved past me. Guests barely nodded in my direction. Ethan never once looked my way. At the end of the evening, as the couple danced under golden light, I slipped out into the night air. The music faded behind me, replaced by the sound of my footsteps echoing down the empty street. For the first time, I admitted to myself what I had been denying for years. I had lost my son long before the church outburst, and on that wedding night, I was not just unwanted, I was erased. By the time Christmas arrived, the distance between Ethan and me had grown into a chasm no bridge could cross. Yet still, I went to the church, clutching a small gift wrapped in plain paper, a photo of him as a child, framed with care. I thought, perhaps, this night might soften his heart. Perhaps the spirit of Christmas might remind him of the father who never stopped believing in him. The sanctuary glowed with golden light, carols rising in the air, families gathered close in pews. I took a seat toward the back, watching Ethan stand proudly with his wife and Robert near the altar. My chest swelled with longing, but also pride, as any father might feel until Ethan's eyes found mine. His gaze hardened into something cruel. After the service, when families gathered for photos, I approached with hesitant steps, gift in hand. "Just one picture," I whispered. "Let me stand beside you, son." Ethan's voice cut the air sharp as a blade. "You don't belong with us. Leave. Thanks for watching." And then everything's of course dead. For a moment, the world went silent. The choir stopped laughing. The children froze in their play. His words rang louder than the church bells themselves. I tried to hold steady, tried not to crumble, but my hands shook around the little wrapped frame. My gift nearly slipped to the floor. He turned his back, drawing his wife and Robert into the photo as the flash went off. I was left outside the frame, outside his life. No one stopped me. No one called me back. The same congregation whose homes I once rebuilt after storms lowered their eyes and said nothing. Snow fell heavy as I walked out into the night, the bitter wind slapping against my face. My boots crunched against the frozen ground, carrying me away from the warmth of the church, away from the son I had sacrificed everything for. The gift in my coat pocket weighed like stone. In that moment, I understood. I had not only lost Ethan, I had been cast out, exiled, before the very eyes of God and every soul I once called family. Long before the humiliation, there were years of sacrifice etched into my bones. After the divorce, it was just Ethan and me. I knew a single paycheck wouldn't cover tuition, rent, and the endless needs of a growing boy. So I took on 2 jobs, construction by day, security guard by night. My body ached constantly, joints screaming from 12-hour shifts, but I kept moving, fueled by the thought of Ethan walking across a graduation stage. I remember nights when exhaustion pinned me to the steering wheel at red lights, my eyes closing despite the blare of horns behind me. I'd stumble into our small apartment, boots still caked in mud, and find Ethan asleep on the couch with his textbooks spread across his chest. I'd cover him with a blanket, kiss his forehead, and remind myself, this is why I endure. On weekends, while other men my age played golf or went fishing, I hammered drywall and hauled steel. Every extra dollar went straight into Ethan's future. I skipped meals so he could eat more, skipped doctor visits so he could see the dentist, skipped rest so he could dream freely. My health withered, but I wore my fatigue like armor. Each scar on my hands, each bruise on my shoulders, was proof of love. Still, I never let him see how deep the sacrifice cut. To Ethan, I wanted to appear strong, unshakable. I told him bedtime stories with a smile, even when my voice cracked from exhaustion. I helped him with math homework, though my mind was fogged with fatigue. I cheered at his school games with cracked lips and bloodshot eyes, pretending I wasn't working myself into the ground. And for a time, I thought he understood. He would hug me tight after victories, whisper, "Thanks, Dad," and beam with pride when teachers praised my dedication. But somewhere along the way, as he grew older and Robert's shadow lengthened, those thanks faded. The boy who once clung to me stopped seeing the cost I carried. The sacrifices became invisible, just as I would one day become invisible too. Ethan was 16 when I handed him the keys to his first car. It wasn't new, far from it. A used sedan with scratches along the doors and a dent in the bumper, the kind of car other kids might laugh at. But to me, it was everything. I had worked months of overtime, saved every spare dollar, skipped more than a few meals just to afford it. When I placed those keys in his hand, my heart swelled with pride. This was freedom. This was safety. This was my gift of love. I'll never forget the look on his face. For a brief moment, his eyes lit up the way they did when he was a child. He threw his arms around me and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." That hug erased every ache in my body, every sleepless night. In that instant, I believed it was all worth it that he knew, even if only for a heartbeat, the weight of what I carried for him. He drove off that night with friends, laughter spilling out the windows as the taillights disappeared down the street. I stood in the driveway long after the car was gone, the cool night air wrapping around me, my chest filled with something close to joy. I imagined him driving to college interviews, job opportunities, a future I had bled to give him. But over time, that car became another symbol of distance. He stopped thanking me, stopped remembering how it came to be his. He began comparing it to the shiny cars Robert's stepchildren drove, cars bought with ease, not sacrifice. "It's just a beat-up old thing," he once muttered, tossing the keys on the counter. My stomach sank, but I stayed quiet. I didn't want to burden him with guilt. I only smiled and said, "As long as it gets you where you need to go." Inside, though, I carried the sting, because to me, that car wasn't just transportation. It was a piece of my life, carved away for him. And watching him dismiss it so casually was the first time I felt the fracture between us deepen into something more permanent. Love, I learned, could be forgotten as quickly as a dent in the bumper. There was a time when my career could have taken me across the ocean. A firm I had worked with for years offered me a lucrative contract in Europe, 3 years of work that would have secured my retirement, paid off every debt, and given me comfort I had never known. My colleagues urged me to take it, told me it was the chance of a lifetime, but when I looked at Ethan, still so young, still reeling from the divorce, I knew I couldn't leave him, not then, not ever. I turned it down, quietly, without fanfare. I told the firm I couldn't relocate. They didn't understand. Some of my peers mocked me behind my back, saying I had thrown away everything for a child who would one day grow up and forget. I shrugged it off. I thought, let them laugh. My son needs me more than I need wealth. The truth was, Ethan had nightmares then. He'd wake in the middle of the night, calling for me, crying that his mother had left, that the house felt empty. I would sit at the edge of his bed, stroking his hair, whispering promises I had no idea how to keep, that I would never leave him, that I would always be there. How could I chase money overseas when my boy's heart was breaking at home? So I stayed. I built smaller projects, took lower pay, lived with the gnawing worry that one day I might not have enough. But I never regretted it. Each morning, when Ethan stumbled into the kitchen with messy hair and tired eyes, I handed him breakfast and thought, this is worth more than gold. Years later, when Ethan looked me in the eye and said, Robert's the one who showed me how to succeed, the memory of that contract came rushing back. I had given up the world for him, and in the end, it was as if the choice had never mattered at all. To him, my sacrifices were invisible. To me, they were scars I carried in silence. When my ex-wife's mother fell gravely ill, I didn't hesitate. She was no longer family by blood, no longer tied to me by marriage, but she had once welcomed me into her home like a son, and more than that, she had been Ethan's grandmother. I couldn't stand by and watch her suffer. The hospital bills piled high, crushing in their weight, and no one else stepped forward to shoulder them. So I did. I sold my apartment, the one piece of security I had left. It wasn't much, just a modest place with creaking floors and a leaky faucet, but it was mine. It was the only thing that proved I had built something for myself after the divorce. I signed the papers with a shaking hand, knowing I was giving up my stability, my anchor, for the sake of someone who had once loved my boy. The money went straight to the hospital, not a penny spared. After that, I moved into a cramped rental apartment on the edge of town. The ceilings were low, the paint chipped, and the pipes groaned in the night. I slept on a sagging mattress, the draft seeping through thin walls. But every time I visited the hospital and saw Ethan's grandmother resting comfortably, breathing easier, I told myself it was worth it. Ethan never knew. I never told him. He was busy with school, with friends, with building a life of his own. I didn't want to burden him with guilt or make him feel indebted. I only wanted him to see that love meant sacrifice, that family meant giving even when it hurt. But years later, when he looked at me with cold eyes and said Robert had shown him what real family was, I felt that hidden sacrifice burn in my chest like fire. The apartment had been my last piece of pride, the place I thought I might retire in peace. I gave it up quietly, without recognition, without thanks. And in return, I was forgotten. It was then I began to understand. In Ethan's world, my sacrifices were not treasures, they were dust, swept aside and buried beneath Robert's wealth. When Ethan came to me with his business idea, his eyes burned with the same fire I had once seen when he was a boy building model towers out of scrap wood. He wanted to start a company, bold and ambitious. And though I didn't understand all the technical jargon, I understood one thing clearly. He needed help. His voice carried both excitement and desperation, and I knew what he was asking before he even spoke it aloud. Dad, I just need a little push to get started. Once the investors see I've got backing, they'll jump in. I looked at my retirement savings, the small sum I had managed to scrape together after decades of labor. It was supposed to be my safety net, the cushion for the years when my body could no longer bear the weight of bricks and beams. But when I saw Ethan's hopeful expression, I didn't hesitate. I emptied the account, slid the papers across the bank desk, and signed away my future. Every dollar went into his dream. The first months were filled with promise. Ethan called me with updates, told me about meetings, showed me brochures with sleek designs and bold visions. I listened with pride, feeling that maybe, just maybe, this sacrifice would not be in vain. I pictured him standing before crowds as a successful entrepreneur, finally acknowledging the man who made it possible. But as time passed, the calls grew shorter, less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. When I tried to ask about the company, he brushed me off. Robert's handling the big investors now, he said once, his tone sharp, as though my involvement was an inconvenience. My money, my sacrifice, had become invisible the moment Robert's wealth stepped in. I told myself it didn't matter that I hadn't invested for recognition, but for love. Still, the silence gnawed at me. I had given him everything I had left, the last of my future, and all I received in return was distance. That's when the truth began to settle like ash. I was not a partner in his success, not even a father in his eyes. I was just the stepping stone he had used to climb higher, a stone he now refused to look back at. The night Ethan cast me out of the church, I walked home alone beneath a sky heavy with snow. Families passed me on the street, their laughter spilling into the frosted air, arms full of gifts and children tugging at their coats. I must have looked like a ghost drifting through their joy, an old man with empty hands, trudging toward an apartment colder than the winter wind. Inside, the silence hit me first. No voices, no music, no trace of warmth. I set down the small wrapped frame I had carried for Ethan, the photo of him as a child, and stared at it until my eyes blurred. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, as though opening the gift for myself. There he was, a gap-toothed smile, messy hair, his tiny hand clutching mine. The boy I remembered was gone, replaced by a man who looked at me as though I were nothing. I sat at the kitchen table with a plate of leftovers from the night before. The turkey was cold, the bread stiff, but I ate slowly, each bite tasting like ashes. I imagined Ethan at a long table filled with food and family, Robert at his side, laughter echoing through the halls. I tried to picture myself there, but the image broke apart. My place had been erased, my chair empty. At midnight, church bells rang in the distance, muffled by snow. I bowed my head, whispering a prayer I wasn't sure anyone heard. I asked, not for forgiveness, not even for reconciliation, only for strength to endure the loneliness. The walls of the apartment felt smaller that night, pressing against me like a cage. I thought of all the years I had given, all the nights I had stayed awake working, all the dreams I had sold just to see him smile. And now I was left with nothing but silence. That Christmas, I learned a truth sharper than any blade. The worst kind of exile is not from a country or a church. It is from the heart of your own child. That night after the church, after the cold walk home and the empty meal at my kitchen table, I sat alone in the dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. I stared at the framed photo of Ethan as a boy, the one I had carried to the service, and let the silence swallow me whole. It was in that silence that the truth finally settled deep into my bones. Every sacrifice I had made, every double shift, every missed opportunity, every dollar scraped away for his dreams meant nothing to him now. In his eyes, I was not a father. I was a burden. The thought cut deeper than the humiliation of being cast out in front of hundreds of people. Betrayal in private wounds, but betrayal in public brands you with shame that never washes off. For hours, I replayed his words in my mind. Robert is my real father. They echoed like a hammer against my chest, striking again and again. I wanted to fight it, to argue, to remind him of the truth. But what good were words when his heart had already chosen another man to take my place? What good was pleading when pride and poison had built walls taller than any bridge I could construct? And yet, in the midst of that despair, a spark flickered. It wasn't hatred. Hatred would have been too easy. It wasn't forgiveness either. No, it was something colder, sharper, resolve. If Ethan could erase me so effortlessly, then I would stop begging for space in his life. If he wanted me gone, I would give him exactly that, but not before I reminded him who I truly was. I whispered to the dark room, my voice steady for the first time in years. If truth is all I have left, then truth will be my weapon. The silence didn't answer, but it felt different, not empty anymore, heavy with purpose. My role as his father had ended that night, but another role was just beginning. The morning after that silent vow, I woke with a new clarity. My heart still ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. If Ethan wanted to sever me from his life, so be it. But I would not let him bury the truth beneath wealth and arrogance. I started small, almost hesitantly, as if testing the ground beneath my feet. I walked to the public records office, a place most people ignore, and began searching. At first, it felt absurd. What was I hoping to find? But as I combed through company filings, tax records, and local court documents, I began to see threads, thin lines of inconsistency, numbers that didn't quite add up. Ethan's company, the empire he had boasted about, was not as flawless as it seemed. Behind the glossy brochures and gala speeches lay debts hidden under shell names, delayed filings, and suspicious amendments scribbled into margins. I spent hours bent over old computers, printing pages until my fingers ached from the weight of the paper. Each file I pulled was like a stone added to the foundation of something larger. I highlighted dates, circled signatures, underlined discrepancies. The engineer in me, the man who once built towers, was back. But this time I was building a case, brick by brick. The more I uncovered, the less absurd it felt. Ethan wasn't just lost to arrogance. He was sinking in deceit. And while Robert's money might have propped him up for appearances, the structure was rotten at its core. I left the records office that evening with a folder tucked under my arm, my breath misting in the winter air. For the first time since the church humiliation, I felt steady. This was no longer about earning back his love. That chapter had ended. This was about truth, and truth had weight. I could feel it pressing against me, cold and undeniable, like the snow crunching beneath my boots as I walked home. My son had erased me as a father, but as a witness, as the keeper of truth, I had just begun. The deeper I dug, the uglier the truth became. It wasn't just sloppy paperwork or forgotten deadlines, it was deliberate deceit. The first crack appeared in the records of a charity drive Ethan's wife had proudly organized the year before. I remembered the photographs splashed across social media, her in a glittering gown, holding oversized checks, smiling beside city officials. The caption had read, "Together we raised $100,000 for children in need." The community praised her as a saint. I had even clapped politely at the time, though I stood in the back, unnoticed. But the documents told a different story. The so-called charity fund had been funneled through a shell account. Less than a quarter of the donations ever reached the children's hospital. The rest vanished into operational expenses, which, as I traced further, turned out to be luxury hotel stays, designer clothes, and first-class flights. Every receipt screamed indulgence, not generosity. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the papers spread across the table like a map of betrayal. My hands shook as I pieced it together, not from weakness, but from fury restrained. Ethan and his wife had stood before flashing cameras, basking in applause for robbing the very people they claimed to serve. It was fraud, dressed in sequins, theft hidden behind staged smiles. I thought of the congregation at church, the same neighbors who had turned their faces away when Ethan cast me out. They believed his family was noble, untouchable. They didn't see the rot beneath the glitter, but I saw it now, line by line, and I made copies of everything, each receipt, each bank transfer, each signed document. I kept them in neat folders, labeled and dated like evidence in a trial. For years, Ethan had erased me with words. But these papers could not be erased. They spoke louder than any insult, colder than any rejection. In those fraudulent donations, I saw my hidden weapon beginning to take shape. Not long after uncovering the charity scandal, whispers began to reach me from unexpected places. Old colleagues, men I had once built towers and bridges alongside, still had ties to the business world. Over coffee in quiet diners, they leaned across the table and lowered their voices. "Walter, you didn't hear this from me," one said, eyes darting around, "but Ethan's company is bleeding money." At first, I thought it was jealousy. Success always draws rumors. But as the stories repeated from different lips, a pattern emerged. Investors were uneasy. Contracts were stalling. Payments delayed. The polished image of Ethan's startup glossy brochures, grand speeches, fancy galas was crumbling beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, people whispered about missing funds, about employees who hadn't been paid on time, about projects promised but never delivered. I listened carefully, never revealing my own motives. I nodded, sipped my coffee, asked casual questions. Then I went home and wrote everything down. Each rumor, each detail, each name. I treated them like bricks, stacking them one atop another, building a structure of truth that could withstand scrutiny. One colleague told me of an investor who had pulled out at the last moment after noticing discrepancies in Ethan's reports. Another mentioned a vendor threatening to sue for unpaid invoices. A third swore that Ethan had shouted at staff behind closed doors, blaming them for numbers that wouldn't balance. Individually, they were whispers. Together, they were a chorus of warning. Sitting at my worn kitchen table, I realized something vital. Ethan wasn't just reckless with family. He was reckless with everything. His arrogance blinded him, made him believe he could charm his way past numbers and contracts the same way he had charmed his way past loyalty. But numbers don't forgive. Ledgers don't forget. I added each rumor to my growing folder. The evidence was no longer just paperwork. It was voices, witnesses, people who had seen the cracks and turned away. And one day soon, I would make sure no one could turn away anymore. The more I traced the threads, the more tangled they became. One night, buried in stacks of court documents and financial statements, I found the first mention of a lien placed against Ethan's company. At first it looked like a clerical note, something minor, but as I dug deeper, the truth surfaced like rot under fresh paint. Ethan had been taking out loans in secret. Not small loans either, millions, borrowed against assets he didn't fully own. I combed through filings, cross-checked signatures, and what emerged was a pattern of desperation. He had mortgaged future contracts that never materialized, promised returns that never existed, and funneled borrowed money into maintaining the illusion of success. The cars, the galas, the lavish home, it wasn't profit funding them. It was debt stacked upon debt, a tower swaying on a cracked foundation. The worst part? Some of those loans were in his own name, others in shell companies tied to his wife. Together, they had built a paper empire balanced on quicksand. Creditors were circling already, their claims piling up like vultures gathering on a fence. Ethan must have thought he could outpace them with charm and showmanship. But numbers don't bend to charisma. I printed the documents, each page heavy in my hands. I stared at Ethan's signature, bold and arrogant, scrawled across agreements he could never keep. I remembered the times I had signed my own name on overtime sheets, on checks that barely covered bills, on forms that traded my body's strength for his future. Where my sacrifices had been silent and invisible, his signatures screamed recklessness for all the world to see. By the time I filed the copies into my growing folder, I knew this was no longer just whispers or rumors. It was undeniable. Ethan was drowning in debt, and worse, he was dragging others down with him. Investors, employees, anyone who had believed in him. I whispered into the quiet of my apartment, the truth cold and steady. This won't stay hidden forever. I didn't have to look far for the next piece of truth it found me. Word of Ethan's arrogance had traveled far, and soon former employees reached out in hushed tones, careful not to be overheard. We met in quiet corners of diners, at park benches after dusk, their voices low, eyes darting like fugitives. What they told me painted a picture even darker than I had imagined. One young woman, barely out of college, spoke of months without pay. He told us the checks were coming, always coming, but they never did. She clenched her fists as tears filled her eyes. Another man, older, described being fired on the spot for questioning the company's finances. I gave him 2 years of my life. He tossed me out like garbage. Story after story poured out. Promises made, promises broken. Numbers altered on reports. Deadlines pushed with excuses. Ethan had silenced dissent with intimidation, leaning on Robert's influence to keep people quiet. The fear in their eyes told me just how ruthless my son had become. I listened without interrupting, writing everything down in a small notebook. Every date, every accusation, every name. I asked no leading questions, offered no judgments. I let their anger and disappointment fill the air. They spoke to me not because I was Ethan's father, but because they saw in me someone who understood what it meant to be discarded. When the meetings ended, I walked home with my notes tucked close, my heart heavy. These were people who had believed in him, who had given time and effort just as I had once given love and sacrifice. And like me, they had been cast aside the moment they were no longer useful. Their pain echoed mine, their silence mirrored my own. As I filed away the testimonies with the rest of my growing evidence, I realized something chilling. Ethan's betrayal of me was not unique. It was simply the pattern of his life. He used people, drained them, and when they had nothing left to give, he erased them. Father, employee, investor. To him, we were all the same disposable. For weeks, I sifted through whispers, rumors, and fragments of paper that hinted at Ethan's corruption. But what I uncovered next was no longer suggestion, it was certainty. Hidden in a stack of routine filings, buried like a snake under leaves, I found a series of altered invoices. At first glance, they looked ordinary, but the numbers didn't line up. Payments listed for equipment that was never purchased. Expenses claimed for offices that didn't exist. My pulse quickened as I traced the pattern, each false entry leading to the same place. Ethan's personal accounts. I printed everything, spread the pages across my table, and stared until the picture sharpened. It was fraud, plain, undeniable fraud. Ethan had siphoned money through falsified expenses, redirecting funds into his own pockets, while investors and employees believed the company was thriving. I could almost hear his voice, smooth and confident, telling them lies with the same ease he had once told me, "I'll make you proud, Dad." The most damning piece came when I found a signature, bold, slanted, unmistakably his. Ethan hadn't even tried to hide it behind someone else's hand. His arrogance had made him careless. The very proof that could destroy him was written in his own name. I sat back in my chair, breath heavy, heart pounding. My hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of the discovery. For years, I had begged my son to see me, to acknowledge what I had given. He had turned his back, chosen wealth over blood. But here, in black ink and crooked numbers, was the truth he couldn't erase. Not with his words, not with his pride, not with Robert's money. I made copies 3 sets, one hidden in a drawer, another in a locked box, the third tucked into an envelope, ready to send if anything happened to me. As I sealed them, a strange calm washed over me. The years of humiliation, the nights of loneliness, the endless sacrifices they had all led to this. My son had erased me as a father, but I had found the evidence that would erase the mask he wore before the world. For the first time in years, I felt something close to strength. I whispered into the stillness of my apartment, steady and cold. "This is enough to bring you down, Ethan." By the time I gathered the last of the documents, the shape of my purpose had become clear. I no longer wandered through papers in anger or grief. I worked with precision, as I once did when I built bridges. Every page of evidence, every testimony, every altered invoice, fit together like steel beams, locking into place. What I was building now was not for Ethan's benefit. It was for justice. I sat at my kitchen table, the folders stacked high, each one labeled and dated. In those piles lay the truth: fraudulent charities, hidden loans, falsified invoices, silenced employees. A blueprint of deceit, all traced back to my son. The same son who once clung to my hand as we crossed busy streets now stood on the brink of ruin, and I was holding the match. But this wasn't about revenge, not anymore. Revenge is fueled by hate, and I had no hate left. Only emptiness. And within that emptiness, clarity. Ethan had chosen to erase me. He had cast me out in front of God and the congregation. Fine. Let him erase the father. But he could not erase the witness I had become. I whispered the plan aloud, testing the sound of it against the silence. Collect, protect, expose. Each step as clean and sharp as a cut of glass. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would simply let the truth do what it always does, cut through the lies. That night, I packed the folders into a single box and slid it beneath my bed. For the first time in years, I lay down without the ache of helplessness pressing on my chest. I didn't sleep long, but I slept steady. The path ahead was set. My role as Ethan's father had ended, but my role as the architect of his reckoning had only just begun. I approached the evidence as I once approached blueprints, measured, patient, exact. For weeks, my apartment transformed into a workshop of truth. Papers lined the walls, notes covered the table, and folders sat stacked like bricks, ready to form a fortress. I reread every testimony, rechecked every signature, compared every date until there were no cracks left in the foundation of what I was building. This wasn't a collection of suspicions anymore. It was a case, airtight and undeniable. I organized it all into sections: fraudulent charities, hidden loans, falsified invoices, unpaid employees. Each folder thick, each one damning. I labeled them in bold ink, not for myself, but for those who would one day read them: the journalists, the lawyers, the officials. I wanted no confusion, no room for excuses. When the time came, the story would tell itself. Nights were the hardest. My body ached from age, my hands stiff with arthritis, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. I worked with the same focus I once brought to construction sites, when one wrong calculation could topple a building. Only this time, the structure I was erecting wasn't steel or stone, it was justice, piece by piece, page by page. Sometimes I would pause, staring at Ethan's signature scrawled across fraudulent documents, and feel the sting of memory. The boy who once drew stick figures on my work blueprints, who begged me to teach him how to measure wood, had grown into a man who used ink not to build but to deceive. The sorrow pressed heavy on me, but the anger never returned, only resolve. By the time the final folder was sealed, I knew there would be no turning back. This was no longer about humiliation in a church pew. This was no longer about being erased as a father. This was about truth standing where love had fallen. And I would deliver it, steady and cold, like the engineer I once was, ensuring that when the collapse came, no one could say it was an accident. I chose a Monday morning, when the city still yawned awake and the week's news cycle was fresh. The folders I had prepared were no longer mine to guard. They were weapons, and weapons must be used. I divided the evidence into carefully sealed envelopes, each marked for its destination: a local journalist with a reputation for tearing apart corruption, the state attorney's office, and a handful of investors who had once believed Ethan's promises. Each envelope heavy with truth, each one capable of shattering the image my son had built. At the post office, the clerk barely looked at me as I slid the packages across the counter. To her, it was routine. To me, it was war. As I watched the envelopes disappear into bins, I felt something strange, not triumph, not bitterness, but release. The burden I had carried in silence for so long was no longer mine alone. Soon, the world would see. It didn't take long. By afternoon, headlines flashed across digital screens. Charity fraud allegations against rising entrepreneur. Whispers of debt and deceit surround Harris Company. The words spread like fire. I imagined Ethan waking in his mansion, his morning coffee trembling in his hand as the first calls came in. Journalists at his gate, investors demanding answers. His name, once polished and praised, now stained in bold print. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling untouched beside me, watching the storm from a distance. I didn't call anyone. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of speaking louder than any man's voice. By nightfall, television anchors were dissecting the documents, laying out the fraud step by step. Ethan's smile beamed from the screen, but this time it was paired with the word scandal. For the first time since the church, I didn't feel invisible. The world could see him now, not the son I had raised, but the man he had chosen to become. And for once, it wasn't my silence that defined me. It was the truth. The unraveling came swiftly, like a storm ripping shingles off a roof. The moment the first headline hit, Ethan's empire began to crumble. Investors who had once sung his praises now refused to return his calls. Board members who had toasted his vision suddenly announced their resignations, citing personal reasons. Allies who had posed for photographs at galas quietly deleted their posts, erasing any trace of connection to him. Even Robert, always smug at Ethan's side, turned cold. A source close to the family leaked that he had refused to cover Ethan's debts, calling him reckless and unworthy of further support. For years, Robert had stood as the shining figure Ethan measured me against. Now even Robert had stepped back, letting him fall alone. The charity world reacted next. Invitations dried up overnight. His wife's name, once listed in bold print on glossy event flyers, vanished from guest lists. Committees she once chaired issued statements of deep concern, distancing themselves before the fallout grew worse. Their mansion, once a palace of flashing cameras and holiday parties, became a fortress of silence. Blinds drawn, phones unanswered, gates locked. I watched it all unfold on the evening news. Reporters camped outside their home, microphones ready, their questions sharp as knives. Neighbors whispered, shaking their heads as they walked past. The same society that had applauded them now turned away in disgust. Isolation closed in around them, not with a bang, but with a steady suffocation. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I only sat in my chair, the evidence folder closed on my lap, and listened to the silence in my apartment. Once, that silence had been my punishment, my exile. Now it was something else. It was proof that I had endured, that while they had chosen glitter over grit, lies over truth, I had chosen patience. And patience, at last, was delivering justice. Ethan had once told me, "Robert makes me feel untouchable, but no man is untouchable when truth comes knocking." And now, the knocking had only just begun. When the story reached its boiling point, I made my final move. I walked into the county courthouse with a plain box in my arms. No fanfare, no audience, just the steady sound of my footsteps echoing down marble halls. Inside that box lay the entire case: fraudulent charities, falsified invoices, hidden loans, testimonies from those Ethan had wronged. I placed it on the clerk's desk and signed the forms. With one motion of my pen, I turned whispers into official record. But the courthouse was not the only place I delivered truth. A second set of documents went to the press, and within hours, the media swarmed. Reporters carried my son's name on every broadcast, every headline, every breaking news alert. Their cameras lingered on his mansion gates, on the courthouse steps, on his once proud face now pale with fear. The same cameras that had celebrated his entrepreneurship and his wife's charity now dissected every lie they had spun. The first hearing was packed. Reporters filled the aisles, microphones raised, their lenses fixed on Ethan as he entered. I sat in the back, silent, unseen among the crowd. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with something colder certainty. I had built this structure with patience and precision, and now it stood tall, undeniable. When the judge read the charges, I watched Ethan's jaw tighten. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, words that struck harder than any insult he had ever thrown at me. His wife sat beside him, trembling, her hand clutching his arm as if she could hold back the tide. But tides cannot be stopped, and this one was rising fast. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning, Journalists shouted questions he could not answer. Did you steal from your own investors? What do you say about the missing donations? He pushed through them with his head down, but the world had already seen enough. The image of Ethan Harris, the golden son, the community's pride, was gone. And I, still silent, walked past the chaos, into the winter air. The cold hit my face like truth itself, sharp, clean, undeniable. Justice had stepped into the light, and there was no going back. It was after the second hearing that Ethan finally came to me. He didn't come with cameras or reporters, no audience to perform for just a son, cornered and desperate. He found me outside the courthouse, standing by the stone steps as snow drifted down in soft spirals. For a long moment, he said nothing, only stared at me with eyes I once knew but no longer recognized. Eyes that had been hardened by greed, now clouded by fear. "Dad," he began, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to stop this. Thank you, Selv. There's he's said in main servity." I said nothing. The word "dad" sounded foreign on his tongue, as though he was borrowing it just for this moment. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know you've got more. Just retract it. Destroy it. We can fix this. Robert will help if you give me time." His hands shook, not from the cold, but from panic. He reached out, grabbing my arm. "You don't understand. If this keeps going, I'll lose everything. Everything I built, everything I worked for, gone. Is that what you want? To see me ruined?" I finally turned to him, meeting his gaze with a silence sharper than any words. Ruined? He had ruined himself long before I ever opened a single file. He had ruined the bond between us, the truth of our family, the meaning of sacrifice. What stood before me was not my son. It was a man who believed lies could stand forever. He must have seen the answer in my eyes, because his expression twisted. Anger bled into his fear. "You're doing this because you hate me," he hissed. "You've always hated me. Admit it." But I didn't hate him. I didn't feel anything close to hate, only clarity. I slowly pulled my arm free, leaving him standing in the swirl of snow, breath ragged, eyes wide. I walked down the courthouse steps without a word, each step echoing like a verdict. For the first time in his life, Ethan faced a truth he could not argue with, a silence he could not overpower, and it terrified him. If Ethan's mask cracked in the courthouse, his wife's shattered in the weeks that followed. She had always thrived in the spotlight charity galas, magazine covers, her name on every guest list. But once the fraud surfaced, the spotlight turned brutal. Invitations vanished. Calls went unanswered. The same committees that once begged for her presence now issued cold statements condemning her mismanagement and ethical failures. Thank you for watching. I watched on television as cameras hounded her outside boutiques and restaurants. Once she had walked proudly, chin high, dripping in designer jewelry. Now she lowered her head, shielding her face behind dark glasses, the jeers of onlookers cutting sharper than any headline. One clip showed her trying to enter a charity luncheon uninvited. The doors closed on her with a firm shove. Her composure crumbled right there on the sidewalk, tears streaking her makeup as reporters circled like vultures. The mansion, once a palace of noise and parties, fell silent. Neighbors whispered that she rarely left, that deliveries of wine and liquor arrived daily, stacked at the gate. Rumors spread of shouting matches behind closed curtains, her voice shrill, his voice breaking. Whatever perfect image they had crafted together was in ruins, and she was drowning in its collapse. What struck me most wasn't the spectacle, it was the irony. She had been the one to boast of virtue, to flaunt generosity that was nothing more than theft. She had looked down on me the way Ethan had, dismissing me as irrelevant, unworthy of standing beside them. Now, the world dismissed her in the same way, and she could do nothing to stop it. I didn't rejoice. I didn't pity her either. I simply noted the symmetry, how lies always collapse under their own weight. Ethan had chosen her family, chosen their glittering world over the man who had carried him through storms. And now that glitter was turning to dust in her hands. Justice wasn't just touching Ethan, it was consuming everything he had built, everything he had chosen over blood. The day came when Ethan could no longer avoid me. The hearings, the headlines, the betrayals of his so-called allies had cornered him, stripped him of the armor of pride he once wore so easily. He found me in the courthouse corridor, away from the cameras this time, his steps quick, his face pale, his voice rising with desperation. "You destroyed me," he shouted, the words echoing off the cold stone walls. His hands shook at his sides, fists clenched like a boy denied a toy. I looked at him and saw not the man he pretended to be, but the frightened child who once begged me never to leave. But that child was gone, buried under years of arrogance and lies. I didn't answer right away. Silence is heavier than anger. He stepped closer, his voice cracking. Say something. You wanted this. You wanted to watch me fall. I met his eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in decades. No, I said, my voice low but steady. You destroyed yourself. Hand! The words landed harder than any punch. His face twisted, rage giving way to something like fear. Around us a few journalists lingered, notebooks ready, their pens frozen in midair as they caught the moment. Cameras flashed just in time to capture his expression, a man hearing the verdict of his own life. For once, I didn't tremble. For once, it was Ethan who couldn't hold my gaze. He turned away, his shoulders collapsing, his steps faltering as he retreated down the hall. The microphones that had once worshipped his every word now recorded his silence, the silence of a man undone. I stood still, watching him disappear around the corner. No satisfaction filled me, no gloating triumph, only certainty. The truth had done its work. The reckoning was here, and nothing could shield him now. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters, their voices sharp, their cameras flashing like lightning against the gray winter sky. Ethan had stormed off, his wife trailing behind him, her face hidden beneath oversized sunglasses. The world knew now. Their names were no longer gilded on invitations or praise from pulpits. They were etched into headlines as symbols of fraud and shame. I walked out the same doors, unnoticed by most. No cameras turned my way. No reporters shouted my name, and I preferred it that way. I had lived my life in silence, in shadows, giving everything so my son could stand in the light. Now that light had burned him, exposed him, and I had no need to bask in its glow. The cold air struck my face as I descended the courthouse steps. Each breath felt clearer, sharper, as if the weight I had carried for decades was finally lifting. Snowflakes clung to my coat, but I no longer felt their sting. I carried no folder, no evidence, no burden. The truth had been set free, and it no longer belonged to me, it belonged to the world. Behind me, chaos reigned, shouted questions, slammed car doors, the desperate scramble of a reputation collapsing. Ahead of me stretched only quiet streets, the kind I had walked all my life, boots steady against the snow. I didn't look back, not once. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain, no need to beg for recognition or forgiveness. This wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was release. As I reached the end of the block, church bells rang in the distance, their sound rolling across the winter air. Once, those bells had told my humiliation, my exile from the heart of my own child. Now, they rang with something different. Not celebration, not mourning, but freedom. I kept walking, each step steady, each breath lighter. Whatever future remained for me would be mine alone. And for the first time, that was enough. After the storm passed, after the hearings and the headlines and the collapse of Ethan's empire, I moved quietly into a small house on the edge of town. Nothing grand, 2 bedrooms, a creaking porch, a garden patch in the back. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I didn't live under the shadow of sacrifice or the weight of someone else's needs. Every nail, every brick, every quiet corner belonged to me. In the mornings, I tended the garden. My hands, once rough from hauling steel and concrete, now worked gently with soil, coaxing green shoots from the earth. I grew tomatoes, beans, and herbs, small things that reminded me life could be nurtured without being consumed. In the evenings, I sat by the fireplace with a book, letting the crackle of flames replace the noise of old regrets. Neighbors stopped by, sometimes kind people who didn't know my past, who only saw an older man with kind eyes and a steady hand. They asked for advice on repairs, and I was glad to give it. For once, I wasn't giving away years of my life, only small acts of knowledge, freely offered and freely received. It was enough. At night, when the house grew quiet, I would step onto the porch and look at the stars. I no longer prayed for reconciliation, no longer begged heaven for Ethan's love. Those prayers had dissolved the night he cast me out of the church. What I prayed for now was simpler. Peace in the days I had left, dignity in the silence I had earned. The house was modest, the garden small, the nights long, but they were mine. And after a lifetime of sacrifice that left me invisible, claiming something as my own felt like the greatest gift of all. In my old life, silence had been a punishment. Every unanswered phone call, every empty mailbox, Every night without a knock at the door, it had been proof that Ethan no longer cared. I used to sit at the table, waiting, staring at the phone as though sheer willpower could make it ring. I carried hope like a stone, heavy and useless, dragging me down with every year that passed. But now, silence was different. It wasn't loneliness, it was peace. The phone still didn't ring. The mailbox still held nothing from Ethan, but I no longer flinched at the emptiness. I no longer rehearsed words I would never say. I no longer begged heaven for one more chance to be heard. That chapter was over. I stopped checking for his name in newspapers, stopped scanning the congregation when I went to Sunday service. When neighbors whispered about the scandal that had consumed him, I offered no comment. I refused to let his shadow define me anymore. My life was no longer a waiting room for his forgiveness. It was my own space, my own time. Some nights, I thought back to the boy who once hugged me tight after winning a school game, who whispered, "Thanks, Dad." That memory still ached, but I learned to let it drift like smoke instead of chaining it to my heart. I could love the boy he had been without longing for the man he had become. No more pleas, no more waiting. The silence no longer mocked me, it freed me. And in that freedom, I found something I had been denied for decades: dignity. It was strange how quickly the same people who once turned their faces away began to greet me again. At the market, neighbors who had watched in silence while Ethan cast me out of the church now nodded respectfully, some even stopping to speak. "You were right all along, Walter," one man whispered as he helped me carry a bag of flour to my truck. Another woman, eyes full of guilt, confessed, "I should have said something that night, I'm sorry." In this, I accepted their words, but I didn't cling to them. Their apologies couldn't erase the years of humiliation, nor did I need them to. What mattered was that the truth had surfaced, and with it, the false image of Ethan had collapsed. The same congregation that once praised him now lowered their eyes when his name was mentioned. His wife, once admired as a patron of charity, had become a warning, a reminder of how easily greed can masquerade as virtue. At church, the whispers that had once cut into me like knives shifted. People no longer spoke of me as the burden Ethan claimed I was. Instead, they nodded when I entered, offered me a seat, even reached out their hands in peace. But I never sought their validation. Respect given too late is a fragile thing. I sat quietly, prayed quietly, and left quietly, my dignity intact. What mattered most was not their change of heart, it was mine. I no longer craved their approval, no longer burned with the shame of being cast aside. Their recognition was a shadow compared to the light of truth I carried within myself. I had endured their silence, survived their indifference, and outlasted their misplaced loyalty. Community can turn as quickly as the wind, I learned. One day it praises, the next it condemns. But my worth was never theirs to grant or take away. That belonged to me, and I had finally reclaimed it. When the next Christmas Eve came, I returned to the same church where my son had once shattered me with his words. The snow still clung to the steps, the chandeliers still glimmered above, and the congregation still filled the pews. But the air felt different. This time, there were no whispers behind my back, no mocking glances, no son standing tall to humiliate me, only quiet respect. I sat near the middle instead of hiding at the back. A few heads turned, eyes meeting mine with something closer to reverence than pity. The choir sang, their voices rising like a tide, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of shame pressing on my chest. I prayed not for reconciliation, not for Ethan's return, but for strength to continue living with dignity. When the service ended, families gathered for photographs again. I watched them smile, their children tugging at coats, their laughter echoing off stone walls. Once, I would have ached to be part of that scene, to stand proudly beside my son. But now, I felt nothing but stillness. Ethan was not there. His scandal had barred him from these walls. His absence was its own justice. As I stepped outside, snowflakes swirled in the cold night air. The bells rang out, not as a reminder of exile this time, but as a signal of freedom. I pulled my coat tighter and walked slowly down the steps, past people who greeted me softly, with nods or handshakes. No one dared to push me aside or erase me from the frame. I was no longer invisible. That night, I returned to my modest home and placed a single candle in the window. It burned bright against the darkness, steady and unwavering. I didn't need family photos, applause, or even forgiveness. The flame was enough, a symbol that I had endured the storm, and the cold could no longer touch me. One evening, not long after Christmas, I sat in my living room staring at the last photo of Ethan I had kept on the shelf. It was old him as a teenager, grinning with one arm slung over my shoulder, the pride in my eyes almost blinding. For years, I had held onto that picture as proof that once he had been mine. Proof that love had existed between us, even if it was gone now. But as I looked at it that night, I felt no warmth, only distance. The boy in the frame no longer lived in the man who had stood in church and denied me. That boy was gone, erased by greed, by arrogance, by choices that had nothing to do with me. And I realized I no longer had to chain myself to a memory that had rotted into pain. I opened the drawer of my desk, slid the photo inside, and turned the key. Not torn, not burned, not destroyed, just hidden away, locked where I no longer had to see it every day. In that act, I felt something break inside me. But it wasn't grief. It was release. I was not his father anymore. Not by his choice, and now not by mine. For decades, fatherhood had defined me. Every decision, every sacrifice, every scar had been carved in the name of being a dad. To let it go felt like erasing myself. But as the drawer clicked shut, I understood something vital. I had been more than a father. I had been a builder, a provider, a man who endured storms and carried burdens. Ethan could take away the title, but he could never erase the truth of who I was. That night, I slept without dreams of reconciliation. I no longer waited for his voice, his letters, his apology. My fatherhood had ended not with death, but with choice. And in that choice, I found peace. The reporters came eventually. They always do. Even after the trials, even after the headlines cooled, they wanted a final quote from me, the father of the fallen man. They knocked on my door one cold afternoon, microphones ready, their faces eager for a soundbite that could crown their story. I stood on the porch, the wind tugging at my coat, and listened as they fired their questions. Do you feel vindicated? Do you regret exposing your own son? Will you ever forgive him? For a moment, I thought of staying silent. Silence had been my shield, my language for years. But I knew if I didn't speak now, they would invent words for me, twist the truth to fit their hunger. So I straightened my back, looked directly into their cameras, and spoke with the calm of a man who had carried too much for too long. This isn't revenge, I said. My voice didn't waver. This is justice knocking. The reporters froze, pens still, microphones steady. They wanted more, but I gave them nothing else. I turned, walked back inside, and closed the door. Let them write their stories. Let them broadcast my face. I had said all that needed to be said. Inside, I sat at my table and poured myself a cup of tea. The words still lingered in the air. Not fiery, not triumphant, but final. I didn't need to justify myself to strangers. I didn't need to explain the decades of sacrifice, the humiliation, the betrayal. The truth had already spoken. My words were only the punctuation at the end of a long, brutal sentence. I sipped the tea slowly, the warmth steadying me. Outside, I could hear the reporters packing their things, their footsteps fading. By nightfall, I was alone again. But this time, I didn't fear the solitude. I embraced it, for I had spoken the truth aloud, and it was enough. The seasons turned, and with them, the noise of scandal faded. Ethan's name disappeared from the headlines, replaced by fresher stories of other men who thought themselves untouchable. But the damage was done. His empire was gone, his allies vanished, his reputation shattered beyond repair. And I, the father he had erased, walked forward lighter than I had ever felt. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in fire and ash, I left my small house and walked the quiet road beyond town. The fields stretched wide, the horizon endless. Each step crunched against gravel, steady and sure. I carried nothing, no folders, no photographs, no burdens, only myself. In the distance, church bells rang. Once, their sound had marked my exile, echoing the shame of being cast aside by my own blood. Now, they sounded different, not like condemnation, not like mourning. They rang like freedom. Every toll was a reminder that I had endured, that I had lived long enough to see truth rise above lies. I didn't look back, not at the road behind me, not at the years I had given, not at the son who had chosen another man in my place. Forgiveness never came, and I never sought it. Love had ended, and I no longer chased its ghost. The wind was cool against my face as I walked, steady and unhurried. For the first time in decades, I felt no chains on my shoulders, no weight dragging me into silence. My life was my own again, quiet, solitary, but free. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered into the empty air, Not to Ethan, not to Robert, not to anyone but myself. No more. Then I kept walking, leaving the past behind me, never to return.